It's Dukes and Bell Sports Radio 92.9 The Game. Let's talk to our buddy Seth Emerson. Guys, he covers the Dogs. Season starts this week. Seth, I'm concerned, I want you to tell me, maybe I shouldn't be, about the fact that the Dogs only have two fully healthy scholarship tailbacks, and neither one of them has played a college game. Should I be concerned?
You should be if their first two opponents weren't UT Martin and Ball State. And, even getting I'm trying not to lump South Carolina in every time with UAB and these other two teams that I just mentioned for the first month of the season, because we kind of look past South Carolina and we lump them in with them. And I've said, and I wrote yesterday, that Auburn in week 5 for Georgia may be on paper their second hardest game after the trip to Tennessee. But the fact of the matter is, if you're going to have these injuries, this is now the time to have them. And I think they're going to be fine at running back if they don't have another major injury or two, which, running back is a position that you unfortunately do have those. But, they've got they like what they've got in those two guys, Andrew Paul, who's coming off an ACL, even though he's healthy now. You have to kind of say that. And then the other one is Roderick Robinson, who's a true freshman. But Kendall Milton and John Edwards are supposed to be practicing this week. And if they don't play on Saturday, it'll be because of who the opponent is in preserving them. But if they were opening up against Oregon or Clemson, I'm certain they would be playing.
Yeah, Seth, I feel like with you could argue that Milton is due some good luck. It's almost like he feels like Craig Lumpkin, back in the day. He just can't seem to stay healthy. The other thing is, and I just looked it up, South Carolina's run defense gave up 200 or more yards 7 times last year, and they're missing some pieces, some injuries and transfer portal. So, yeah, you're not worried about what's your level of concern about Beck? It seems like the coaching staff, everybody just seems to feel he is good to go.
Yeah, we just don't know about him until he gets into some real games where the games are really in doubt. He's talked about how over the last couple of years he's matured a lot. He's worked on the mental part of the game. And you just kind of have to hope, if you're a Georgia fan, that is borne out for when you do get in some games that are crunch time. And look, that's going to happen at some point unless Georgia rolls through 15 games this year without it ever being close. But look, is Carson Beck going to be able to go out there and get you, a baseline of 10 wins this year? Yeah, he's going to be able to do that, especially with everyone else around him. But it's when things get in crunch time. It's when you have a close game, when you have a Missouri-like game from last year, and that's not even could the quarterback get you back in the game through his arm. It's the mastery of the offense, the command of the offense, command of the plays. And then it's the games like, obviously, Ohio State last year, where Stetson Bennett willed that team back in the fourth quarter. Stetson Bennett was not a perfect quarterback for Georgia over the last 2 years, but in the fourth quarter of the national championship game against Alabama, he was great. In the fourth quarter and much of the third quarter of the Ohio State game last year, he was great. And the question about Carson Beck is just going to be whether he has that clutch gene the way that Stetson Bennett did. And we're not going to know that until he's put in that situation.
Seth, let's talk about the secondary. I don't think, again, they will be challenged in these first two games, but there are lots of changes, right, with Bullard, Tyke Smith, Kamari Lassiter. What's that going to look like in the back half of this defense?
It'll be interesting to watch Bullard because you're taking a guy who was defensive MVP of both playoff games last year at one position, and you're moving him positions, but you're putting him where he's going to play more. The nickelback is basically a starting position now in college football and at Georgia, but there are still some plays where they come off. And this way, Bullard's on the field every time because as much as Georgia rotates on defense in general, they don't rotate those two safety spots and those two cornerback spots, and they never have. You want your best 11 on the field for every play as much as possible, and he's not only one of their best 11, he's one of their best 3 or 4 defensive players. But what you have then is you have experience. Like Tyke Smith, when he transferred here 2 years ago, people thought he was going to be the star right away, and it just didn't happen. But now you're talking about a guy who's a fifth-year senior who hasn't played much the last 2 years, but he played a lot before that at West Virginia. So it's a pretty good secondary that should buy some time for the cornerback, the inexperienced cornerback, who at the outset looks like will be Julian Humphrey. Some time to learn the ropes. And so look, it's college football in 2023, and in this era, that secondary is going to give up some passes. They're going to give up some plays. It's just the way things are. But it looks on paper like a defense, a secondary that can be pretty good, relatively good.
It is a Seth Emerson, guys, from The Athletic on the waitfor.com hotline. As you mentioned, Lassiter and Bullard, and you talked about Tyke Smith. They last year, I thought Kirby was almost talked around the secondary because there were times like the Ohio State Buckeyes, they kind of exposed that secondary. They were good enough in SEC play until you got to the playoffs, it seemed like.
Yeah, and honestly, that happens a lot anyway. I mean, you could even talk about the LSU game. It's something going back to the 2020 season that I remember asking Kirby about because he's had to adjust to the way college football is, and that he wants to play man-to-man. That's what he wants to do with his secondary. And he, at that point in 2020, was kind of the low point later in that year, after they've lost to Alabama, they lost to Florida, and they're not going to make the SEC championship for the first time in 3 years, where he's rethinking some things and he's seeing his defense vulnerable. And he says, I want to be a man-to-man guy, but can I do that the way that college football is being played now with so many pass-happy offenses? And I think they're still largely doing that. I mean, they mix in zone, they try to be strategic about it, but they've kind of decided and that's what you're going to do. You give them some help, give these cornerbacks some help by having the safeties help sometimes, and making that kind of a staple of the pass defense. But he's been able to largely stay with being a man-to-man secondary and take your lumps. And that means that you're going to make some plays in the passing game if you're going against Georgia. But it also means you're going to have to make some plays in the passing game because you can't run on Georgia, which to me remains kind of the X factor for Georgia's defense this year because of all the defensive linemen that they've lost. And does it finally accumulate? Does it finally catch up to them? Or is just Georgia always going to be a great run defense?
Seth, you know what I'm looking at right now? I'm looking at a depth chart for Georgia. And today we find out that Nick Saban, is neglecting to put out a depth chart of any form for the first time in 17 seasons with the Crimson Tide. He did not release a formal depth chart saying it's a distraction. Okay, wait a minute. Kirby's the defending national champ. I'm looking at the depth chart for Georgia, and here Alabama is saying they don't want to put one out. What's going on here?
Where do you see a depth chart for Georgia? What did I miss? I was just over there.
I'm looking at your depth chart. Who will play? Who second team, first team?
That was a depth chart that I did. Yeah, that's not
the
Kirby
official
depth chart.
Okay, so does Kirby put out a depth chart? Will he put out a depth chart?
No, he has not. Like, the only depth chart we ever see is one that the Sports Information Department puts out after the game to reflect how the depth chart looked when they played the game 2 days before. Kirby has not put out a depth chart for years.
So with Saban, this is the first time they're saying in 17 seasons with the Crimson Tide, he's not released one. What do you think is happening there? What's the deal?
I don't know that he didn't do it before. I thought I don't cover Alabama, so I don't remember like on a day-to-day basis, and I don't know it for sure, but I don't know that anybody has been in the habit of releasing depth charts. It's some teams do, and the big debate now is becoming availability reports, and it's something that Kirby was asked about today, and he said he would generally be in favor of it. This is basically the answer that every coach gives, which is this is NFL-style injury reports. And every coach that I've asked this for years has said they will do it as long as everybody has to do it. But as long as there's no rule where everybody has to do it, then I think Missouri maybe one of the only ones in the SEC that releases some sort of injury report. But it's something that's coming. I think it's got to come at some point because of the gambling problems.
And just real quick, Seth, because of the quarterback situation last year, where Jalen Miller looked like he had to really work on his throwing, Buckner coming in from Notre Dame. I mean, do you still feel that Georgia's got a better quarterback in Carson Beck than almost everybody except for LSU?
Let's see, go through everything. I mean, look, Georgia could end up having the best quarterback in the SEC by the end of the year, or it could end up having the 7th or 8th best quarterback. There's just so many variables. I mean, yeah, I would not, if I'm Georgia, I'm definitely not trading my quarterback situation with Alabama's right now. It reminds me too much of what Mark Richt and Brian Schottenheimer felt they had to do in 2015 by going and getting Grayson Lambert after spring practice, being a reflection of, we're not very happy with what we saw in spring practice. And now I don't think Tyler Buckner is going to end up being the starter for Alabama, at least to start the year. So maybe that had the desired effect of getting Jalen Milroe and or Ty Simpson to increase their, But I honestly, if they needed the kick in the butt at that point, I don't know if that's a good sign anyway. No, Jaden Daniels, Spencer Rattler,
KJ Jefferson, Arkansas, Milton.
KJ Jefferson is probably the second best. Joe Milton, and people forget about Will Rogers at Mississippi State. If you're Georgia, you're not trading your quarterback situation for Alabama's or Florida's or Auburn's, those type of teams. Also, watch out for Devin Leary at Kentucky.
Transfer. Good stuff, Seth. Appreciate you, man. As always, great coverage, guys. Follow him. He writes for The Athletic and covers our dogs. And, Seth, we'll talk to you soon.
All right, guys.
Cool. A lot of people feel with Carson. You brought this up. What if Carson Beck is better in the pocket than as far as throwing? The wide receivers. I mean, from the 2 tight end set now to arguably maybe the most dynamic wide receiver core in the SEC.
Yeah.
And the vertical passing game with Bobo, which we can do that too.